The great assembly hall of the Galactic Council stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystalline floor, its vaulted ceiling lost in artificial clouds that drifted among floating platforms where delegates from 1,000 worlds conducted the business of civilization. Ambassador Zexhai of the Vorthak Dominion stood at his designated speaking platform, his 4 arms gesticulating wildly as he addressed the assembled representatives. The humans have gone too far this time. Zexhai's voice boomed through the translation matrix, his words automatically converted into the native tongues of every species present. Their interference in the Kepler 442 mining dispute shows a complete disregard for established protocols. They've disrupted operations that have been running smoothly for 2 centuries. Murmurs of agreement rippled through several delegate sections. The insectoid karate clicked their mandibles in approval, while the crystalline beings of Proxima Delta pulsed with supportive light patterns. Ambassador Thren of the Altarian Republic leaned forward on his platform, his blue-scaled face stern with disapproval. The human delegation's behavior during the trade negotiations with the Rim worlds was equally problematic, Thren added. They questioned procedures that have maintained peace and prosperity across 17 sectors. Their constant demands for ethical oversight and fair representation disrupt the natural order we've spent millennia perfecting. In the human delegation section, Ambassador Sarah Chun sat motionless, her dark eyes scanning the faces of those who spoke against her people. Beside her, General Marcus Webb's jaw tightened with each accusation, while Dr. Elena Vasquez took careful notes on her tablet. The 4th member of their permanent delegation, cultural attaché David Park, watched the proceedings with the calm expression of someone who had seen this performance many times before. Speaker Prime Veltar, an ancient being whose species had founded the Council 8,000 years ago, raised a tentacle for silence. The massive jellyfish-like creature floated in a specialized chamber filled with bioluminescent gases, its thoughts transmitted directly into the translation matrix. The chair recognizes Ambassador Chun of the Human Territories. Veltar's translated voice carried the weight of eons. The floor is yours to respond to these concerns. Sarah Chun rose slowly, her simple gray diplomatic uniform a stark contrast to the elaborate robes and ceremonial armor worn by most other delegates. She walked to the central speaking platform with measured steps, her heels clicking softly against the crystal floor. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I find myself in the curious position of being accused of disrupting order by asking questions. The Kepler 442 mining operation that Ambassador Zexhai defends so passionately has resulted in the displacement of 3 million indigenous beings. Their homes, their sacred sites, their entire way of life has been swept aside for the extraction of rare minerals that primarily benefit the most powerful member worlds of this council." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. As for the Rim World's trade agreement, we questioned why 70% of the profits from their agricultural exports would flow to core world banking consortiums, while the farmers themselves receive barely enough to maintain subsistence levels. These are not disruptions of order, honored delegates. These are questions of justice. Ambassador Zexhai's 4 arms waved dismissively. Justice is a primitive concept, suitable for species that have not yet evolved beyond emotional decision-making. The Council operates on principles of efficiency and stability. The strong guide the weak. The advanced civilizations shepherd the primitive ones. This has worked for 8 millennia. Worked for whom? Chen's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath her words. The Kepler 442 natives who now live in refugee camps? The Rim world farmers who cannot afford to feed their own children while their grain feeds the core worlds? The 17 species that have gone extinct in the past century because their worlds were developed by more advanced civilizations. An uncomfortable silence fell over the assembly. Many delegates avoided meeting Chen's gaze, while others glared at her with open hostility. The truth of her words hung in the air like an accusation. Counselor VYSS of the Hegemony Coalition stood abruptly. The towering reptilian being's scales flashed angry crimson as he spoke. The humans have been members of this council for barely 3 centuries. They dare to question systems that have maintained galactic peace since before their species learned to make fire. This arrogance is precisely why many of us opposed granting the membership in the first place. Peace. Chen repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. You call it peace when the strong devour the weak with bureaucratic efficiency. When entire species are classified as developmentally insufficient, and their worlds are strip-mined while they watch helplessly. When trade agreements are structured to ensure that wealth flows upward to the same dozen core worlds that have dominated this council since its founding. Speaker Prime Veltar's tentacles writhed in what might have been agitation. Ambassador Chun, you speak as if the council's policies are malicious in intent. Our systems have created the longest period of galactic stability in known history. Yes, there are costs, but the alternatives are far worse. Before the council, there were constant wars between species, genocide, the collapse of entire civilizations. And now, Chen's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her diplomatic composure. Now there are no wars because resistance is impossible. There's no genocide because entire species are simply reclassified as resources or obstacles to development. Civilizations don't collapse because they're absorbed into the Council's economic machinery long before they can threaten the established order. The assembly erupted in angry voices. Delegates shouted accusations and demands for order. Several species representatives stood and began walking toward the exits, their ceremonial garments rustling with indignation. Enough! Veltar's mental voice crashed through the translation matrix with such force that several of the more telepathically sensitive species physically recoiled. This session is recessed. We will reconvene tomorrow to address these concerns in a more structured format. As delegates began filing out of the Great Hall, many clustering in small groups to whisper urgently among themselves, Chun remained at the central platform. She watched the exodus with sad eyes, seeing in their departure a confirmation of what she had long suspected. General Webb approached her, his expression grim. That went about as well as expected, he said quietly. Actually, it went better than I hoped, Chun replied. Did you see how many couldn't meet my eyes when I mentioned the extinct species? How quiet they got when I talked about the rim worlds. Some of them know what this council has become. Dr. Vasquez joined them, her tablet clutched against her chest. Elena, how many species have formally complained about council policies in the past century? Chen asked. 47 major complaints, 218 minor ones, Vasquez replied without hesitation. All dismissed or buried in committee. The pattern is always the same. Raise concerns, get referred to a subcommittee, watch the issue disappear into bureaucratic limbo. David Park had been silent throughout the exchange, his diplomatic training keeping his thoughts hidden behind a neutral expression. Now he spoke quietly, his words meant only for their small group. I've been monitoring communications traffic all morning. 7 different species delegations have sent coded messages back to their home governments requesting immediate consultation. This isn't just about our accusations anymore. We've forced them to confront something they've been trying to ignore. She nodded slowly. She had known this day would come eventually, had been preparing for it since the first time she sat in this chamber, and watched the council casually approve the relocation of an entire species to make way for a new shipping lane. Marcus, she said, turning to the general, how long would it take to implement Protocol 7? Webb's face went carefully blank. Protocol 7 was a contingency plan that had been developed in the deepest classified levels of human government, known only to a handful of individuals. It was the plan they had hoped never to use. 72 hours for full implementation, he replied, though some elements could begin immediately. Elena, I need a complete analysis of council economic data for the past century. Focus on trade relationships, resource extraction agreements, and development projects. I want to know exactly how much the human territories contribute to the council's economy. Sarah, Park said quietly, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, the diplomatic consequences will be severe. Once we take this step, there may be no going back. Chen looked around the now mostly empty assembly hall, its vast space echoing with the whispered conversations of the few remaining delegates. The floating platforms drifted like islands in a sea of artificial clouds, beautiful and serene and completely disconnected from the reality of what happened to those who dare to challenge the system they supported. David, I've been a diplomat for 28 years. I've negotiated treaties, resolved disputes, and genuinely believe that working within the system was the best way to create positive change. But this isn't a system that can be reformed from within. It's a machine designed to concentrate power and resources among the already powerful while maintaining the illusion of fairness and representation. She gestured toward the council's Great Seal, a complex symbol that supposedly represented unity among diverse species. Look at that symbol. 43 different species, traditional marks woven together in harmony. Except if you actually study the design, you'll notice that the marks of the core worlds are larger and positioned at the center, while the newer member symbols get smaller and pushed toward the edges. Even their grand symbol of unity is a hierarchy disguised as equality. The four humans stood in contemplative silence for a moment, each understanding the magnitude of what was being discussed. They were potentially talking about severing humanity's relationship with the greatest alliance in galactic history, walking away from technologies, trade relationships, and protections that had benefited their species enormously. But they were also talking about refusing to be complicit in a system that ground entire civilizations into raw materials for the comfort of the few. There's something else, Dr. Vasquez said hesitantly. I've been tracking the species that have gone extinct since we joined the Council. The official cause is always listed as natural evolutionary pressure or failure to adapt to galactic standards. But when I cross-referenced the timing with Council development projects, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But the implication hung heavy in the air. The Council wasn't just allowing species to go extinct, it was actively eliminating those that couldn't be profitably integrated into its economic machine. How many know? Chen asked. Hard to say, for certain. But based on voting patterns and communication traffic, I'd estimate that most of the core world delegations know. They've known for decades, maybe centuries. For them, it's just the cost of doing business. General Webb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. As a military man, he had seen war and death and the terrible prices of conflict. But there was something particularly chilling about genocide carried out through bureaucratic procedure, extinction delivered with proper documentation and legal justification. The question, Park said carefully, is whether we're prepared for what comes next. If humanity withdraws from the Council, we lose access to their trade networks, their technology sharing programs, their mutual defense treaties. We'd be on our own in a galaxy where most of the major powers view us as upstart troublemakers. But we'd also be free to act according to our own principles, Chun countered. Free to offer aid to species the Council has written off as non-viable. Free to develop trade relationships based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. Free to prove that there's another way to organize galactic civilization. The weight of the decision settled over them like a heavy cloak. They weren't just four diplomats having a philosophical discussion. They were potentially determining the course of human civilization for generations to come. As they walked slowly toward the exit, Chen's mind was already racing through the implications of Protocol 7. The carefully planned withdrawal of human personnel from Council facilities. The recall of human ships from joint operations. The termination of trade agreements that had bound humanity to the Council's economic system. But, more than that, it would be a statement that would echo across the galaxy. A declaration that some principles were more important than prosperity, that some compromises could not be made, regardless of the cost. Elena, she said as they reached the transport platform, I want detailed projections on what happens to those species currently under Council protection if we withdraw our support. I won't be responsible for abandoning those who depend on us. Already working on it, Vasquez replied. The Taotians, the Galese colonies, the refugee populations from the Delta sectors, we've been their primary advocates within the council structure. If we leave, then we find other ways to help them, Chun said firmly. Ways that don't require us to enable a system that treats entire civilizations as expendable. As their transport carried them away from the council complex, Chun found herself thinking about her daughter, who was serving aboard a human exploration vessel in the Outer Rim. What kind of galaxy would she inherit? One where her species was complicit in a vast machine of oppression, or one where humanity had chosen a harder, but more ethical path? The next 72 hours would determine the answer to that question. Back in the Great Assembly Hall, maintenance drones glided silently through the empty space, preparing for the next day's session. They moved with mechanical efficiency, their programming optimized for maximum productivity with minimal resource expenditure. They were, in their own way, a perfect metaphor for the council itself, coldly efficient, utterly indifferent to the concerns of those they served, and completely convinced that their methods were the only rational way to operate. But, unlike the drones, the council was about to discover that some systems had flaws that couldn't be corrected by simple reprogramming. Some problems required fundamental changes that challenged everything the system believed about itself. And sometimes the most profound changes began with someone simply saying no and walking away. As the artificial night cycle dimmed the lights in the assembly hall, the great seal of the council glowed softly in the darkness, its 43 intertwined symbols representing unity and cooperation among diverse species. But in the morning, one of those symbols would begin the process of removing itself from the pattern. And for the first time in 8,000 years, the council would be forced to confront the possibility that their perfect system might not be as perfect as they believed. The human embassy compound sat on a carefully maintained stretch of artificial landscape within the council's capital district, its modest buildings a stark contrast to the towering spires and elaborate architectural displays of the older member species. Sarah Chun stood in her private office, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber, and rose while she reviewed the final elements of Protocol 7. The past 18 hours have been a whirlwind of coded communications with Earth, encrypted conferences with human military commanders across the galaxy, and the delicate process of preparing for a withdrawal that had to appear routine until the moment it became irreversible. Every human diplomat, every cultural attaché, every trade representative scattered across council space had received their instructions. They were to complete their current assignments, file their final reports, and prepare for immediate departure. But they weren't the only ones who had been busy. Dr. Elena Vasquez entered the office carrying a thick data pad and the expression of someone who had spent the night discovering things she wished she hadn't. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of hours spent diving deep into council archives, following data trails that had been deliberately obscured, and piecing together a picture that was even worse than they had imagined. The economic analysis is complete, she said without preamble. I need to show you something, but I warn you it's going to make you angry. Chun gestured to the comfortable chairs by the window, and they sat facing each other with the data pad between them. Outside, council workers were beginning their daily routines, moving efficiently through the manicured gardens and along the pristine walkways that connected the various diplomatic compounds. Start with the basic numbers, Chun said. Human territories contribute 23.7% of the council's total economic output, Vasquez began, calling up holographic charts that hovered above the data pad. That's agricultural products, manufactured goods, technological innovations, raw materials, and services. We're the fourth largest contributor after the Hegemony Coalition, the Altarian Republic, and the Vorthak Dominion. That seems reasonable for our population and development level. It would be if the benefits were distributed proportionally. But they're not. Vasquez swiped through several screens, bringing up a complex web of financial flows. Through trade agreements, development fees, council membership assessments, and various other mechanisms, 67% of human economic output ultimately flows to core world institutions. Chin studied the data, her expression growing grim. We're essentially a tributary state. It gets worse. The technology sharing agreements we sign when we join the council, the ones that supposedly give us access to advanced core world innovations, in practice, we share 17 major technological breakthroughs for every one we receive. And the technologies we do receive are typically obsolete by core world standards. How is this justified? Development assistance, Vasquez said bitterly. According to council records, all of these mechanisms are designed to help younger species mature into full galactic civilization. The economic extraction is supposedly temporary, designed to fund our gradual integration into advanced society. How temporary? Based on the progression models and council planning documents, humanity would achieve full partnership status in approximately 8,000 years. Coincidentally, that's about the same timeline originally given to the Altarian Republic, which is still classified as a developing partner after 6,000 years of council membership. Chun stood and walked to the window, her hands clasped behind her back. In the distance, she could see the council's main administrative complex, its crystalline towers reaching toward the sky like fingers grasping for something just out of reach. Those buildings house the bureaucracy that managed the affairs of over 1,000 worlds, the largest governmental entity in galactic history. They also house the machinery of the most sophisticated system of exploitation ever devised. Elena, what about the species that have gone extinct? You mentioned you'd cross-reference the timing with development projects. Vasquez's voice became very quiet. 43 species have been declared extinct since humanity joined the Council. In every single case, the extinction was preceded by a Council development project that required access to their primary world or resource base. The timeline is always the same. First comes a Council survey mission, then an urgent development need is identified, then the species is relocated for their safety during construction, then they're declared extinct due to failure to adapt to displacement. And the core worlds profit from these developments? Every single time. The Kepler 442 mining operation that Ambassador Zexhai defended yesterday. The minerals extracted, they're processed by Vorthack industrial complexes and sold at a 4,000% markup to species who desperately need them for their own infrastructure projects. Chin closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had suspected the truth was bad, but seeing it laid out in precise detail was overwhelming. The Council wasn't just a flawed institution that made imperfect decisions. It was a deliberately constructed machine designed to concentrate power and resources among its founding members while maintaining the facade of representative government. Have you shared this with Marcus and David? They're reviewing it now. Marcus asked me to tell you that Protocol 7 is fully operational. All human personnel have received their instructions and are prepared to implement them on your signal. A soft chime indicated someone was requesting entry. General Webb and Cultural Attaché Park entered together, their faces reflecting the same grim understanding that Chun was feeling. The Joint Chiefs have signed off on the withdrawal, Webb reported. Earth Defense Command is repositioning our fleet elements to provide security for human territories during the transition period. Admiral Rodriguez estimates we'll have full coverage within 6 hours of implementation. Park settled into one of the remaining chairs, his diplomatic composure showing stress fractures around the edges. I've been monitoring communications traffic from other delegations since yesterday's session. The reaction is interesting. Define interesting, Chun said. 17 species have filed formal requests for emergency sessions to address the human problem. But here's what's curious. 23 other species have filed requests for private consultations with our delegation. Not official meetings, private consultations. Chun raised an eyebrow. What kind of consultations? That's what I spent the night finding out. The Taotians want to discuss what you called alternative approaches to galactic civilization. The Proxima settlers are asking about trade relationships outside Council frameworks. The new Geneva colonies want to know if we're serious about offering protection to species the Council considers non-viable. Vasquez looked up from her datapad. According to the economic models, those three groups alone represent almost a dozen worlds with significant resource bases and technological capabilities. If they withdrew from Council economic systems along with us, it would be the largest economic disruption in Council history, Webb finished. A confederation of free worlds operating outside the core world control structure. Chen walked back to her desk and activated the secure communication array. Earth appeared as a blue marble hanging in the artificial display space, beautiful and distant and waiting for her decision. Marshal Torres, this is Ambassador Chun. I'm requesting formal authorization to implement Protocol 7. The response came immediately. Marshal Elena Torres, head of Earth's Interstellar Affairs Council, appeared as a full-size hologram in the office. Her weathered face was set in hard lines, and her voice carried the weight of speaking for all of humanity. Ambassador Chun, the President, and the Global Security Council have reviewed your preliminary reports. We are prepared to authorize full implementation of Protocol 7. However, I need to hear directly from you. In your professional opinion, is this the right course of action? Chun looked around the office that had been her home for the past 3 years. The walls held mementos from a dozen different worlds, gifts from diplomats who had become friends, awards recognizing her service to the cause of interspecies cooperation. She was about to walk away from everything she had worked her entire career to build. Marshal Torres, 3 days ago, I believed that the Council represented the best hope for peaceful cooperation between species. I believed that our role was to work within the system to gradually improve it, to be a voice for justice and equality in the galactic community. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Yesterday, I learned that the system isn't flawed. It's working exactly as designed. The Council is not a representative democracy that makes imperfect decisions. It's an economic extraction mechanism that uses the language of cooperation and development to justify the systematic exploitation of weaker species. Torres nodded slowly. And your recommendation? Humanity cannot and should not continue to be complicit in this system. But more than that, I believe we have an opportunity to demonstrate that there's another way. If we can create a confederation of worlds based on genuine equality and mutual benefit, we can prove that galactic civilization doesn't require the subjugation of the many by the few. The risks? Enormous, Chen admitted. We'll be challenging the most powerful alliance in galactic history. We'll be giving up technologies, trade relationships, and protections that have benefited our species greatly. There's a real possibility that the Council will respond with economic sanctions or even military action. And the alternative? Chen looked at the datapad where Vasquez's research still glowed with the cold statistics of oppression. The alternative is that we continue to profit from a system that has already eliminated 43 species and is currently in the process of eliminating dozens more. The alternative is that we teach our children that some compromises are acceptable as long as we benefit from them. Torres was quiet for a long moment, her image flickering slightly as the quantum communication array adjusted for subtle gravitational variances between Earth and the Council capital. Ambassador Chun, you have formal authorization to implement Protocol 7. May whatever gods you believe in have mercy on us all. The connection terminated, leaving the 4 humans alone in the sudden silence of the office. Outside, the morning bustle of the diplomatic district continued unchanged, thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds going about their daily business of maintaining galactic civilization. Elena, transmit the economic data to all 23 species that requested consultations, Chun said. Let them see exactly how the Council's economy really works. Marcus, signal all human personnel. Protocol 7 is now active. David, draft a formal statement for delivery to the Council. Simple and direct. Humanity is withdrawing from all Council institutions and terminating all agreements effective immediately. What about the species currently under our protection within the Council framework? Park asked. We'll honor those commitments outside the Council structure. In fact, I want to expand them. Any species that wants to join a new confederation based on genuine equality and mutual benefit will be welcome. Vasquez looked up from her datapad. Sarah, the economic implications of what you're proposing are staggering. We're talking about creating a completely parallel system of galactic commerce and government. Yes, we are. And it's going to be difficult, expensive, and dangerous. But the alternative is continuing to enable the slow-motion genocide of entire civilizations. Webb activated his military communication array and began transmitting coded signals to human forces throughout Council space. Across the galaxy, human diplomats were closing their offices, human traders were completing final transactions, and human military personnel were quietly withdrawing from joint operations with Council forces. But they weren't just leaving. They were extending invitations. The Tausetians received word that their entire species would be welcome in human space, with full planetary autonomy and representation in any future Confederation government. The Proxima settlers were offered immediate trade agreements based on fair market value for their agricultural exports. The new Geneva colonies received promises of military protection and technological sharing without the economic extraction mechanisms the Council used to maintain control. By midday, the first responses were beginning to arrive. The Tausetians had voted to join the human withdrawal. Their entire fleet of research vessels and colony ships was preparing to depart Council space. The Proxima settlers had agreed to a preliminary trade alliance and were requesting technical assistance to upgrade their defensive capabilities. 3 minor species that had been classified as development incomplete by the Council formally requested membership in any alternative alliance humanity might create. But not all the responses were positive. Ambassador Zexhai of the Vorthak Dominion transmitted a formal protest, demanding that humanity reconsider its rash and destructive decision. The message included detailed descriptions of the economic chaos that would result from human withdrawal, the technological setbacks that would affect dozens of development projects, and the strategic vulnerabilities that would be created across multiple sectors. The subtext was clear. Humanity's withdrawal would hurt the Council badly enough that they were willing to negotiate to prevent it. They're scared, Park observed after reviewing the Vorthak message. This is the first time in Council history that a major member has simply walked away. They don't have procedures for this situation, because they never imagined it could happen, Chen replied. The system was designed to make withdrawal economically impossible. They assumed that once a species was integrated into their economic web, it would never be able to extract itself. Can we? Vasquez asked quietly. Chen looked around the office one more time, memorizing the view from the window, the feel of the chair where she had spent countless hours negotiating for what she believed was the common good of all species. Tomorrow, this would be someone else's office, and humanity would be charting a course through uncharted space. Elena, run the numbers one more time. How many species are currently being actively suppressed or exploited by the Council system? 47 species are classified as development incomplete and subject to Council economic management. Another 63 are listed as integration candidates, meaning their worlds have been identified for future Council development projects. And how many have expressed interest in our alternative confederation? So far, 38. If they all follow through, we'd have a population base of approximately 4 billion beings across 57 worlds. Chen smiled for the first time in days. Elena, I think we're going to find out that the galaxy is much larger than the Council wants anyone to believe. And there are a lot of species out there who are tired of being told that exploitation is just the price of civilization. As the afternoon wore on, more responses arrived. Some were hostile, denouncing humanity's actions as destabilizing and irresponsible. Others were curious, requesting more information about the proposed alternative confederation. A few were enthusiastic, praising humanity for having the courage to challenge a system that had oppressed them for generations. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. "Sarah," Park said, his voice carefully controlled, "we just received a coded transmission from the Altarian Republic. They want to discuss the possibility of joining our withdrawal." Chun felt her breath catch. The Altarian Republic was one of the oldest members of the Council, a founding civilization that had helped establish many of the institutions and procedures that govern galactic society. "Are you certain?" "The authentication codes check out. It's from Ambassador Thren himself. He's requesting an immediate private meeting to discuss what he calls fundamental reforms to galactic governance structures." The implications were staggering. If one of the founding species of the Council was considering withdrawal, it would legitimize humanity's action in ways that nothing else could. It would also create a political and economic crisis that could bring down the entire Council system. "Set up the meeting," Chun said. "But not here. Neutral ground." As Park began arranging the clandestine meeting, Chun found herself wondering if they had just lit the fuse on a transformation that would reshape galactic civilization. The Council had maintained stability for 8,000 years by ensuring that dissent was isolated, that opposition was marginalized, and that alternatives were unthinkable. But now the unthinkable was happening. And tomorrow, the Council would have to confront the reality that their perfect system was about to face its greatest challenge. In the depths of the Council's administrative complex, emergency sessions were already being called. For the first time in millennia, the machinery of galactic government was about to be forced to examine its own foundations. And what they found there would shake them to their COR. The neutral meeting point was a small asteroid mining station in the DMZ between Council space and the Independent Systems, a forgotten outpost that processed ice and rare metals for whoever paid the best prices. The station's owner, a gruff Denarian named Kor, asked no questions when diplomatic vessels from 3 different species requested docking privileges within hours of each other. Ambassador Thren of the Altarian Republic arrived first, his sleek diplomatic cruiser dwarfed by the industrial machinery of the mining station. The blue-scaled diplomat moved through the station's corridors with the careful grace of someone accustomed to gravity levels different from the standard Council norm, his ceremonial robes adapted for the practical necessities of space travel. Sarah Chen's shuttle arrived 20 minutes later, followed shortly by a small transport carrying representatives from the Tau Cetian delegation. The 3 groups met in the station's main conference room, a utilitarian space with bare metal walls and industrial lighting that served as a stark contrast to the elaborate assembly halls where galactic diplomacy was usually conducted. "This is highly irregular," Thren began, but his tone suggested he was not entirely displeased with the irregularity. "In 4,000 years of diplomatic service, I have never participated in a meeting that could be considered treasonous by my own government." "Then, why are you here?" Chun asked directly. Thren was quiet for a moment, his large dark eyes studying the faces around the table. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of accumulated frustration. "Because yesterday, for the first time in my very long life, someone stood before the Council and spoke the truth about what we have become. And I realized that I could no longer pretend I didn't know what that truth meant." The Tau Cetian representative, a delicate humanoid named Kes whose species communicated partially through bioluminescent patterns on their skin, pulsed with colors that Chen's translator identified as deep concern mixed with desperate hope. "My people have served the Council faithfully for 800 years, Kes said, their translator rendering their musical language in a standard galactic speech. "We have contributed our scientific expertise, our exploration capabilities, and our cultural insights. In return, we have watched 60% of our worlds designated as conservation zones where we are forbidden to live, while Council development projects strip mine the resources our ancestors considered sacred." Chun activated a portable holographic display and began showing the economic analysis that Dr. Vasquez had compiled. The numbers hung in the air between them like accusations, each statistic representing the exploitation of entire civilizations. The pattern is consistent across all member species, she explained. Economic extraction disguised as development assistance, technological dependence maintained through controlled sharing agreements, and political marginalization justified by claims of cultural immaturity. Thren studied the data with the careful attention of someone who had spent millennia navigating the complexities of galactic politics. These numbers, I have suspected for some time that the Council's economic policies were inequitable, but this suggests something far more systematic. It is systematic, Chen said. The Council isn't a representative democracy that makes mistakes. It's a resource extraction system that uses democratic language to legitimize the concentration of power among the founding species. And your proposed solution? Kess asked, their skin patterns shifting to hues that suggested cautious optimism. Chen leaned forward, her expression intense. We create an alternative, a genuine confederation based on mutual benefit and equal representation. No tribute relationships disguised as development fees. No technological dependencies designed to maintain control. No classification systems that determine which species are mature enough for self-determination. The practical challenges would be enormous, Thren observed. The Council controls the primary trade routes, the most advanced manufacturing facilities, the largest military forces in known space. But they don't control everything, Chen countered. Humanity has spent the past 3 centuries developing our own technological base, our own manufacturing capabilities, our own exploration fleets. We've been careful to maintain some independence precisely because we suspected this day might come. She activated another display, this one showing star charts marked with various strategic assets. Combined human and Taosetian territories control 17 major trade routes that bypass Council space entirely. If the Altarian Republic joined us, we'd have access to some of the oldest and most advanced manufacturing facilities in the galaxy, facilities that predate Council standardization and aren't dependent on their supply chains. Kessa's patterns brightened to excited gold. My people have maintained exploration fleets that operate far beyond Council map space. There are entire sectors where Council influence is minimal or non-existent. Species that have never been contacted by the Council bureaucracy. Species that might be very interested in trade relationships that don't require them to surrender their sovereignty, Thren added thoughtfully. Chen nodded. That's exactly what we're proposing. Instead of expanding by conquest and assimilation the way the Council does, we expand by offering genuine partnership to species that want an alternative to their system. The 3 diplomats spent the next several hours working through the practical details of what such a confederation might look like. The challenges were daunting. Establishing new currency systems, creating interspecies legal frameworks, developing military defense capabilities that could deter Council retaliation. But the more they talked, the more feasible it seemed. The Altarian Republic possessed advanced manufacturing technologies that could produce everything from starship components to planetary terraforming equipment without relying on Council supply chains. The Taosetians had exploration data on thousands of star systems that could provide the territorial base for expansion. Humanity brought not only significant military and economic power, but something perhaps more valuable, a demonstrated willingness to challenge the established order. There is one more consideration, Thren said as the meeting drew toward its conclusion. The Council will not simply allow this to happen. They have too much invested in the current system to permit a major alternative to develop unopposed. What kind of opposition are you expecting? Chen asked. Initially, economic warfare, sanctions, trade disruptions, technological isolation. But if those measures fail to bring the breakaway confederation back into line. Thren paused, choosing his words carefully. The Council has not had to fight a major war in several thousand years, but their military capabilities remain formidable. Shouldn't have been expecting this. Protocol 7 included extensive military preparations precisely because humanity's leadership understood that walking away from the Council system might ultimately require defending the decision by force. We've been preparing for that possibility, she said. Human military doctrine has always emphasized defensive capabilities and guerrilla warfare tactics. We can't match the Council's conventional forces in a direct confrontation, but we can make any attempted reconquest extremely costly. Kess's patterns shifted to worried orange. My people are scientists and explorers, not warriors. We have little experience with military conflict, which is why the Confederation would need to be based on mutual defense rather than individual military power, Chen replied. Each member species contributes according to their capabilities. The Taoceans provide scientific expertise and exploration data. The Altarians provide manufacturing and technological base. Humanity provides military protection and economic organization. And together, we create something stronger than any of us could manage alone, Thren concluded. The meeting concluded with agreements to return to their respective governments for formal consultations. But they all understood that they had just outlined the framework for the greatest political upheaval in galactic history. As Chen's shuttle departed the mining station, she found herself thinking about the message she would need to send to Earth. The Global Security Council would need to understand that they were no longer just talking about withdrawing from the Council. They were talking about creating a rival power block that could fundamentally reshape galactic civilization. The return journey to the Council capital took several hours, giving Chun time to review the intelligence reports that had been arriving throughout the day. The picture they painted was both encouraging and troubling. 47 species had now expressed some level of interest in alternatives to Council membership. The economic disruption caused by humanity's withdrawal was spreading faster than Council economists had predicted, as species that depended on human trade found themselves unable to meet their tributary obligations to the core worlds. But the Council's response was also escalating. Emergency sessions were being held in closed chambers where only the core world species were permitted to attend. Military exercises were being scheduled in sectors adjacent to human territory. And, most ominously, several species that had expressed interest in the human alternative were finding their Council privileges suddenly, subject to administrative review. Dr. Vasquez was waiting when Chen's shuttle docked at the human embassy. Her expression was grim as she handed over the latest intelligence summary. The Council just voted to invoke Article 847 of the Charter, she said without preamble. Chun felt her stomach drop. Article 847 was the Council's equivalent of martial law, a provision that suspended normal democratic procedures in the event of a systemic threat to galactic stability. It hadn't been invoked in over 3,000 years. What does that mean in practical terms? All non-core world species are now subject to enhanced security protocols. Their communications are being monitored, their ship movements are being tracked, and their voting privileges in Council sessions have been suspended pending security assessment. They're consolidating power, Chen realized, stripping away the democratic facade and ruling directly through the core world alliance. It gets worse. They've also announced the formation of something called the Galactic Stability Force, a joint military command authorized to take whatever measures are necessary to prevent the breakdown of galactic civilization. Chen sank in her chair, suddenly, feeling the weight of what they had set in motion. How long do we have? Intelligence estimates suggest the Stability Force will be fully operational within 10 days. After that, Vasquez shrugged helplessly. After that, any species that attempts to leave Council authority will be facing military intervention. And the species that have expressed interest in our Confederation, 19 have formally withdrawn their inquiries and reaffirmed their loyalty to the Council. 16 are maintaining communication but haven't committed to anything. 12 have sent coded messages indicating they're prepared to proceed regardless of Council threats. Chun ran the numbers in her head. 12 species wasn't the broad coalition they had hoped for, but it was enough to create a viable alternative if they could coordinate their efforts effectively. What about Ambassador Thren? The Altarian government has recalled him for consultation. Public statements suggest they're distancing themselves from any association with our withdrawal. Chun felt a stab of disappointment, but it wasn't entirely unexpected. The Altarian Republic had too much invested in the Council system to abandon it without careful consideration of all the implications. But 12 species were still willing to take the risk. Elena, transmit a message to all species still interested in the Confederation proposal. Emergency meeting in 72 hours at coordinates I'll transmit separately. And make it clear, anyone who attends that meeting is committing to proceeding regardless of Council opposition. As Vasquez hurried to prepare the message, Chen found herself staring out the window at the Council's administrative complex. Those crystalline towers had stood as symbols of galactic civilization for 8 millennia, representing the greatest achievement in interspecies cooperation in known history. Tomorrow, they would become symbols of something else entirely. The next morning brought news that changed everything. General Webb burst into Chen's office with an expression of barely controlled excitement. "Sarah, you need to see this immediately." He activated the main display, bringing up a news feed from the Galactic Communication Network. The headline scrolled across the screen in multiple languages. Altarian Republic announces withdrawal from Galactic Council. Chun watched in amazement as Ambassador Thrin appeared on the screen, standing not in the familiar chambers of the Council complex, but in what appeared to be the Altarian Planetary Government Center. His voice was steady and formal as he read from a prepared statement. After 4,000 years of loyal service to the ideals of galactic cooperation, the Altarian Republic has concluded that the current Council system no longer serves those ideals. We hereby announce our withdrawal from all Council institutions and our intention to pursue alternative frameworks for interspecies cooperation. The statement continued with language that was clearly coordinated with humanity's own withdrawal announcement. References to genuine equality and mutual benefit echoed the themes that Chun had been advocating, while careful phrasing avoided any direct criticism that might justify Council military intervention. But the most significant element of the announcement came at the end. The Altarian Republic extends an invitation to all species seeking alternatives to the current galactic order to join us in creating a new confederation based on the principles of voluntary association, mutual respect, and genuine democratic representation. They did it, Chun breathed. They actually did it. Webb nodded grimly. And according to our military intelligence, they did it at exactly the right moment. The Galactic Stability Force isn't ready for deployment yet. The Council is going to need at least another week to organize a coordinated response, which gives us time to consolidate the Confederation before they can move against us militarily. Exactly. But, Sarah, there's something else. In the past 6 hours, we've received formal withdrawal notifications from 8 more species. The Altarian announcement seems to have triggered a cascade effect. Chun felt her pulse quicken. 20 species withdrawing from the Council simultaneously would represent the greatest political crisis in galactic history. The economic disruption alone would be staggering. Show me the list. The names that appeared on the screen represented a cross-section of galactic civilization. Agricultural worlds, mining colonies, research installations, and manufacturing centers. Individually, none of them were powerful enough to challenge the Council. Together, they represented nearly a third of the galaxy's economic output. Elena was right about the cascade effect, Webb continued. The Council's decision to invoke Article 847 seems to have convinced a lot of species that the system was never as democratic as they believed. Suspending voting rights and implementing martial law was apparently the last straw for many governments that had been considering their options. Chun studied the data, her mind racing through the implications. Marcus, can we provide effective mutual defense for all these worlds? If we coordinate properly, yes. The combined military capabilities of the withdrawing species are actually quite formidable. But we'll need to establish unified command structures and standardized defense protocols before the Council can organize their response. How long do we have? Best estimate? 5 days before the stability force is ready to move. But I don't think they'll wait that long. The political and economic damage is escalating every hour. They're going to have to do something to stop the cascade before it reaches critical mass. Shin nodded slowly. The next few days would determine whether they had just started a successful revolution or triggered a devastating galactic war. The emergency conference took place in the Denrian system, a cluster of mining worlds that had declared independence from the Council 48 hours earlier. Representatives from 24 species gathered aboard the massive cargo vessel New Horizon, hastily converted into a mobile conference center as traditional diplomatic facilities were no longer safe from Council monitoring. Sarah Chun found herself looking around the improvised assembly hall with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The delegates represented worlds scattered across 3 galactic arms, species with vastly different cultures and technologies, united only by their shared rejection of the Council's system of controlled democracy. Ambassador Thren had arrived despite his government's official recall, bringing with him a small fleet of Altarian vessels and the manufacturing specifications for defensive technologies that could help level the playing field against Council military forces. The Tau Cetian delegation had contributed detailed star charts showing safe routes through unexplored space, while the Denrian miners offered access to resource extraction operations that could supply a war effort if necessary. But, perhaps most significantly, they had been joined by representatives of 16 species that had never been Council members at all, civilization from the Outer Rim, and the galactic periphery that had been watching the Council's expansion with growing concern. The immediate strategic situation is grave, but not hopeless, General Webb reported to the assembled delegates. Council forces are mobilizing throughout their territory, but they're facing the same coordination challenges we are. They've never had to fight a war against multiple opponents simultaneously, and their command structures are designed for policing actions against individual rebellious worlds, not coordinated resistance from an organized alliance. Delegate Vox of the Crystalline Republics pulsed with concerned orange light as she spoke. Our combined military forces are substantial, but we lack the heavy battle platforms that the Council has been developing for millennia. In a direct confrontation, we would be at a severe disadvantage. Which is why we're not going to fight a direct confrontation, Webb replied. Human military doctrine emphasizes asymmetric warfare, using mobility, intelligence, and coordinated strikes to negate the advantages of superior firepower. Combined with the industrial capabilities that Ambassador Thren has brought to the Alliance, we can produce weapon systems specifically designed to exploit Council military weaknesses. Chun activated the main display, showing a strategic overview of the current political situation. Nearly a quarter of the galaxy was now colored in the gold of the new Confederation, with Council territories marked in the traditional blue and uncommitted systems shown in neutral gray. The political dimension is equally important, she addressed the Assembly. Every day that we maintain our independence and demonstrate that the Confederation is viable, more species begin to question whether Council membership is truly in their best interests. But we need to be careful not to appear as conquerors ourselves. Our expansion has to be based on voluntary association and genuine benefit to new members. Delegate Zara of the Helix Nebula colonies raised a tentacled arm. What about species that want to join but are currently under direct Council control? Do we have any obligation to assist liberation movements? It was a question that went to the heart of what the Confederation would become. Were they simply creating an alternative to the Council system, or were they actively working to overthrow it? Each situation will have to be evaluated individually, Chun replied carefully. But I believe we have a moral obligation to offer assistance to species that request it, provided we can do so without triggering unnecessary escalation. The debate that followed was intense and sometimes heated. Some delegates argued for aggressive expansion, actively encouraging rebellion throughout Council space. Others favored a defensive posture, focusing on consolidating Confederation territory and demonstrating the benefits of their alternative system. The discussion was interrupted by an urgent communication from Dr. Vasquez, who was monitoring council activities from the human embassy's intelligence facility. "Sarah, you need to see this immediately." Her voice came through the secure channel. The council just issued what they're calling the Stability Proclamation. The main display shifted to show the familiar council chamber, but the scene was dramatically different from the democratic assemblies that had taken place there for millennia. Only the core world species were present, their delegates arranged in a circle that emphasized their unity while making clear the exclusion of all other voices. Speaker Prime Veltar floated in his specialized chamber, but his usual measured tones had been replaced by something that could only be described as imperial decree. The Galactic Council hereby declares that the recent actions by certain member species constitute a fundamental threat to galactic stability and the continued survival of interspecies civilization. Species that have withdrawn from Council authority are hereby classified as rogue states, and their governments are no longer recognized as legitimate representatives of their populations. Chun felt a chill run down her spine. The language was unmistakable. The Council was declaring the Confederation to be an illegal insurgency rather than a legitimate political alternative. The proclamation continued with increasing severity. All trade with rogue state territories is hereby prohibited. Any species found to be providing material support to insurgent organizations will be subject to immediate sanctions. The Galactic Stability Force is authorized to take whatever measures are necessary to restore legitimate government to affected worlds. But the most chilling element came at the end of the proclamation. For the protection of civilian populations in affected territories, the Council will be implementing humanitarian intervention protocols. Planets under insurgent control will be liberated and placed under temporary Council administration pending the restoration of legitimate government. The transmission ended, leaving the assembly hall in stunned silence. "They're going to invade," Delegate Kess said, their bioluminescent patterns flickering with fear. "They're actually going to use military force to compel our return." "More than that," Thren observed grimly. "By classifying us as illegitimate governments, they've given themselves legal justification for occupying our worlds indefinitely. They don't intend to negotiate our return to the Council. They intend to abolish our governments and rule us directly." Shin found herself thinking of her daughter, somewhere in the outer rim aboard a human exploration vessel. Was she safe? Were any of them safe now that the Council had abandoned even the pretense of democratic process? "How long do we have?" she asked Webb. "Intelligence suggests the first Stability Force deployments will begin within 72 hours. They're targeting the most strategically important Confederation worlds first: industrial centers, major population areas, resource extraction facilities. Then, we need to make some difficult decisions very quickly," Chen said. She turned to address the full assembly. "Delegates, the situation has changed fundamentally. We are no longer discussing the formation of an alternative to the Council system. We are discussing resistance to what amounts to a military occupation." The debate that followed was unlike anything in diplomatic history. Representatives of dozens of species, many of whom had never worked together before, had to create a unified military command structure, establish rules of engagement, and coordinate defensive preparations across hundreds of worlds, all within the space of a few hours. Some delegates argued for immediate surrender, believing that resistance would only lead to unnecessary bloodshed. Others called for preemptive strikes against Council military bases, hoping to disrupt their mobilization before the Stability Force could be deployed. But gradually, a consensus emerged around a strategy that balanced practical military necessity with the political goals that had brought them together in the first place. "We defend ourselves, but we don't become the aggressors," Chen summarized the emerging plan. "Every Council attack will be met with proportional response. Every world they occupy will become a center of resistance. And, most importantly, we document everything. The galaxy needs to see that the Council's humanitarian intervention is actually military conquest." The Altarian manufacturing facilities were retooled to produce defensive systems designed specifically for the kind of warfare they were about to face. automated defense platforms that could operate independently even if command structures were disrupted, guerrilla warfare equipment that could be hidden on occupied worlds and activated by resistance movements, communication systems that could maintain coordination even under intense council jamming. The Tau-Cetian exploration fleets were tasked with establishing supply routes through uncharted space, creating a network that could keep Confederation forces equipped even if traditional trade routes were interdicted. Their scientific expertise was also crucial for developing new technologies that could exploit weaknesses in Council military doctrine. Human forces provided the backbone of the Confederation's military command structure, but this was not a human-dominated alliance. Each species contributed according to their strengths, and decision-making was genuinely collaborative in ways that the Council had never managed. As the conference concluded and delegates prepared to return to their home worlds to organize defenses, Chen found herself in private conversation with Ambassador Thrin. In 4,000 years of galactic politics, I have never seen anything like what happened in that chamber today, he said quietly. Species with fundamental differences in biology, culture, and technology working together as genuine equals. It's what the Council was supposed to be, and that's exactly why the core worlds are so threatened by us, Chen replied. We've proven that their system isn't necessary. That galactic civilization can function without the concentration of power they've maintained for millennia. The question is whether we'll survive long enough to prove it to the rest of the galaxy. Chen looked out at the stars visible through the viewport, countless points of light representing worlds where billions of beings were about to discover whether democracy or autocracy would shape the future of galactic civilization. 36 hours ago, I was a diplomat trying to work within a system I believed could be reformed. Now I'm helping to coordinate what might be the largest military resistance in galactic history. Any regrets? Thrin asked. Chen thought about the question seriously. Everything she had worked for, everything she had believed about the possibility of peaceful change had been shattered in the space of a few days. She was asking her species and dozens of others to risk everything on the chance that they could create something better than what had come before. None, she said finally, because the alternative is accepting that might makes right, that the strong will always dominate the weak, and that injustice is the price of stability. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are terrible. As the New Horizon began breaking up the conference, delegates dispersing to their home systems to prepare for war, Chen received a priority communication from Earth. President Martinez appeared on her private communicator, his face showing the strain of leading a species into the unknown. Ambassador Chen, I want you to know that the Global Security Council stands behind the decisions you've made. Humanity will honor our commitments to the Confederation, regardless of the cost. Thank you, Mr. President. But you should know that the cost may be higher than any of us anticipated. Sarah, I've been reading the intelligence reports. I understand what we're facing, but I also understand what we're fighting for. My grandmother lived through the corporate wars, when megacorporations tried to replace democratic governments with direct economic control. She used to tell me that some fights choose you, whether you're ready or not. Chen nodded, understanding the historical parallel. Sir, if the worst happens, if the Confederation fails, and our worlds are occupied, I want you to know that what we accomplished here was still worthwhile. We proved that alternatives are possible. Ambassador Chen, the worst isn't going to happen, because we're not going to let it happen. The transmission ended, but Chen felt a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just fighting for their own freedom anymore. They were fighting for the principle that civilizations should have the right to choose their own path. The next morning brought the first reports of Council fleet movements. Massive battle groups were departing from core world systems, heading toward Confederation territories with overwhelming firepower and the complete confidence of a galactic power that had never faced serious opposition. But they were also heading toward something they had never encountered before, a network of free worlds that had chosen cooperation over domination, that had built their alliance on genuine consent rather than economic coercion, and that were prepared to defend those principles no matter the cost. The age of the Council's unchallenged dominance was ending. What would replace it remained to be seen. The first shots of what historians would later call the Liberation War were fired not by massive battle fleets, but by a single automated probe in the Kepler 442 system. The probe had been placed there by Tau Cetian scientists 3 months earlier as part of a routine survey mission, but it had been quietly modified with human stealth technology and Altarian sensor arrays. When the Council Stability Force arrived to liberate the contested mining world, they found something unprecedented. Their every movement, every communication, every tactical decision was being recorded and broadcast live across the Galactic Communication Network. Admiral Karath of the Hegemony Coalition stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching in growing frustration as his fleet's activities were narrated in real time by Tau Cetian scientists who provided calm, objective commentary on what they termed the Council's first military action against civilian populations in 4,000 years. "Disable that probe," he ordered his weapons officer. "Sir, the probe is broadcasting from 17 different positions simultaneously. Our sensors indicate it's actually a distributed network of microtransmitters, probably launched from stealth platforms before our arrival. Then destroy all of them." "Admiral, the transmitters are positioned throughout the system's asteroid belt. Destroying them all would require sustained bombardment that would be visible to observers throughout this sector of the galaxy." Karath understood the implication. Every shot his fleet fired, every aggressive action they took, will be broadcast to billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. The humanitarian intervention that was supposed to demonstrate Council strength was instead becoming a public relations disaster. But he had his orders. The bombardment of the Kepler 442 system lasted 6 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of the planet's defensive installations, the occupation of its 3 major cities, and the establishment of direct Council military administration over a population of 4.7 million beings. It also resulted in something the Council leadership hadn't anticipated: spontaneous protests on 47 worlds where populations watched the bombardment in real time and saw their own futures under direct Council rule. On Proxima Centauri, dock workers refused to load ships bound for Council territories. On New Geneva, the Planetary Assembly voted to formally condemn the invasion and offered asylum to refugees from occupied worlds. Most significantly, on Altair Prime itself, thousands of citizens gathered outside the government complex demanding that their leaders withdraw entirely from the Council system. Sarah Chun watched the coverage from the Confederation's new headquarters on Haven, a previously uninhabited world that had been hastily converted into a coordination center for the Resistance. The reports flowing in from across the galaxy painted a picture of a Council victory that was rapidly turning into a political catastrophe. "The military situation is actually quite favorable," General Webb reported to the Confederation Leadership Council. "Council forces are designed for overwhelming force projection against isolated targets, but they're struggling to maintain occupation forces on multiple worlds simultaneously. Their supply lines are overextended, and they're having to pull forces back from border regions to maintain control in occupied territories." Dr. Vasquez had been monitoring Council communications through intelligence networks that the Confederation had established throughout core world space. "The economic impact is worse than they anticipated. The disruption of trade relationships isn't limited to Confederation worlds. It's affecting neutral systems that depended on the economic networks we helped maintain." Ambassador Thrin, now serving as the Confederation's diplomatic coordinator, had been in contact with resistance movements throughout Council space. 17 species have formally requested Confederation assistance in organizing independence movements. Another 23 are conducting what they call gradual disengagement from Council economic systems. Chun felt a mixture of pride and apprehension as she reviewed the reports. The Confederation was succeeding beyond their most optimistic projections, but success was bringing its own challenges. "The Council is escalating," she noted. "Intelligence reports suggest they're preparing to deploy their reserve fleets. If they commit their full military resources, we won't be able to maintain conventional resistance." Which is why we're not going to fight a conventional war, Webb replied. We've been preparing for this scenario since the beginning. Operation Starfall goes into effect in 18 hours. Operation Starfall was the Confederation's answer to overwhelming Council military superiority. Instead of trying to match their firepower, the plan involved a coordinated campaign of asymmetric warfare that would make occupation of Confederation worlds prohibitively expensive while simultaneously encouraging resistance movements throughout Council space. The operation began with what appeared to be a Confederation surrender. Human, Altarian, and Tausetian fleets began withdrawing from contested systems, broadcasting messages indicating that they were returning to negotiations and seeking peaceful resolution to the current crisis. Council forces moved quickly to occupy the abandoned systems, establishing military governments and implementing what they termed stability protocols, comprehensive monitoring and control systems designed to prevent future rebellion. What they didn't realize was that the withdrawing Confederation forces had left behind something more dangerous than military hardware. They had left behind ideas. The occupation protocols that worked efficiently on isolated worlds became nightmares of complexity when applied simultaneously to dozens of systems. Council administrators found themselves dealing with work slowdowns, communication failures, and equipment malfunctions that seemed random, but followed patterns that suggested coordination. More significantly, they found themselves trying to govern populations that had experienced 3 years of genuine democratic participation and were unwilling to return to the authoritarian efficiency of traditional council rule. The breaking point came in the Vegas system, where council occupation forces attempted to implement standard resource extraction quotas. The planetary population, which had been operating under Confederation economic principles that allowed them to retain 70% of their production for local development, simply refused to comply with council demands for 90% extraction. When occupation forces attempted to enforce compliance through arrests and economic sanctions, they discovered that the entire planetary infrastructure had been quietly modified to require active cooperation from the local population. Automated systems have been replaced with human-operated alternatives, supply chains have been restructured to depend on local knowledge, and production facilities have been designed to shut down safely if operated incorrectly. The Council found itself in the position of trying to force unwilling populations to operate systems they didn't understand, using techniques they didn't know, to produce resources for an economic system they had rejected. It's not sustainable, Admiral Karath reported to the Council leadership in an emergency session. We're spending more resources maintaining occupation forces than we're extracting from occupied territories. And every day we continue, more neutral systems begin questioning whether they want to remain in the Council system. Speaker Prime Veltar's ancient intellect had been focused on the crisis for weeks, his vast mental processes analyzing thousands of variables and projections. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone confronting the failure of everything he had helped build. The Confederation has forced us to confront a fundamental contradiction in our system. We have maintained control through the promise that Council membership provides benefits that outweigh the costs. But we have never had to prove that promise in the face of a genuine alternative. Counselor VYSS of the Hegemony Coalition stirred restlessly. The alternative is chaos. Species making independent decisions without central coordination leads to conflict, inefficiency, and eventual collapse. Does it? Veltar's question hung in the chamber like a challenge. The Confederation worlds are reporting higher productivity, lower crime rates, and increased technological innovation since implementing their alternative governance systems. Their military forces, though smaller than ours, have demonstrated tactical capabilities that our analysts admit are superior to our own. They're primitive idealists who don't understand the complexities of maintaining galactic civilization, Ambassador Zexhai protested. Are they? Their economic models are demonstrably more efficient than ours. Their diplomatic processes are achieving consensus among species that we've never been able to integrate effectively. Their scientific research programs are producing innovations at rates that exceed our most advanced facilities. The uncomfortable silence that followed Veltar's observations spoke to a truth that none of the core world leaders wanted to acknowledge. The Confederation wasn't failing. It was succeeding in ways that made their own system look obsolete. The reports that arrived over the following days only reinforced that conclusion. The Andromedan Trade Consortium, which had maintained neutrality since the conflict began, announced that they were implementing Confederation-style economic reforms and requested technical assistance from former Council worlds. 3 species in the Outer Rim declared independence and immediately applied for Confederation membership. Most dramatically, the Altarian Republic's Planetary Assembly voted to formally withdraw from all remaining Council institutions and commit their full resources to the Confederation cause. But perhaps the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Deep in Council space, on worlds that have been model members for millennia, populations began organizing what they called democratic reform movements. They weren't calling for independence. They were calling for the Council itself to adopt the representational and economic principles that the Confederation had demonstrated. It's spreading, Dr. Vasquez reported during a secure conference call with Confederation leadership. The idea that governments should serve their populations rather than managing them as resources, it's becoming impossible to contain. Chun found herself in the strange position of leading a revolution that was succeeding beyond anything they had planned. The Confederation now represented over 60 worlds, with new applications for membership arriving daily. Their economic output rivaled the core worlds. Their military capabilities had proven sufficient to deter Council aggression, and their political example was inspiring reform movements throughout known space. But success was bringing new challenges. We're receiving formal diplomatic requests from the Council leadership, Ambassador Thren reported. They want to discuss what they're calling a comprehensive reform framework for galactic governance. In other words, they want to negotiate the terms of our surrender, General Webb said skeptically. Or they want to negotiate the terms of their own transformation, Chun countered. Think about what we've accomplished. We've proven that democratic governance can work on a galactic scale. We've demonstrated that economic systems can be both efficient and equitable. Most importantly, we've shown that change is possible. The Confederation Leadership Council spent 3 days debating whether to accept the Council's request for negotiations. Some argued that the Council couldn't be trusted, that any agreement would be a trap designed to restore their control. Others pointed out that the ultimate goal had never been to destroy the Council, but to force it to live up to its own ideals. The decision, when it came, reflected the democratic principles that had guided the Confederation from the beginning. We'll negotiate, Chen announced, but not from a position of weakness seeking accommodation. We'll negotiate as equals, with the goal of transforming galactic civilization into something worthy of the species it serves. The negotiations took place on Haven, in a conference center that had been built specifically for the purpose. Representatives from over 100 worlds attended, including delegation from both the Confederation and the remaining Council systems, as well as neutral observers from throughout the galaxy. The talks lasted for 6 months. The final agreement, which became known as the Galactic Compact, established a new framework for interspecies cooperation based on principles that would have been unthinkable under the old Council system. All member species retained complete sovereignty over their internal affairs. Economic relationships were based on voluntary agreements that could be terminated by either party. Military cooperation was limited to mutual defense against external threats. Most importantly, no species or group of species could exercise authority over others without their explicit consent. The transformation wasn't universal. Several core world species refused to accept the new system and withdrew to form their own smaller alliance based on traditional hierarchical principles. Some Confederation worlds chose to remain independent rather than join the larger galactic community. A few systems decided to experiment with entirely different forms of organization. But for the first time in galactic history, species had a choice. 5 years after the first human withdrew from a council session in protest, Sarah Chun stood in the same assembly hall where the crisis had begun. But the room itself had been transformed, its hierarchical platform arrangement replaced with a circular design where no delegation held a position of privilege over any other. She was no longer Ambassador Chun of the human territories. She was President Chun of the Galactic Confederation, elected by direct vote of all member species to serve a 2-year term before rotating the position to another world. The current debate involved a proposal from the Kepler 442 native population to establish a system of ecological preserves that would be off-limits to all forms of industrial development. It was exactly the kind of proposal that would have been dismissed without consideration under the old council system. Under the compact, it required serious discussion, careful analysis of the impacts on all affected parties, and ultimately, a decision based on genuine democratic consensus. The chair recognizes the representative from the crystalline republics, Chun said, following the procedures that had evolved over years of collaborative governance. Delegate Vox rose from her position, her faceted form refracting light in patterns that conveyed both respect and mild disagreement. While we support the preservation goals outlined by our colleagues from Kepler 442, we believe the proposed implementation timeline is too restrictive. Our analysis suggests a more gradual transition would achieve the same conservation objectives while minimizing economic disruption to current operations. The debate that followed was everything the old council had never been: genuine, respectful, focused on finding solutions that served everyone's interests rather than simply imposing the will of the powerful on the weak. It was also slow, sometimes frustrating, and required patience that autocratic